So this talk is a talk to illustrate the power of scientific thinking, particular scientific thinking that's analytic, that's mathematizable and predictive, and to show the great unity of nature, how everything is interconnected, interrelated, and behaves in a unified way, and how when that is applied to socioeconomic systems, meaning us in modern socioeconomic society, that it has built into it not only its great success, but tragically its own demise if we don't change anything fundamental about social interactions.
I'm Peter Cox, Co-Director of the Global Systems Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Geoffrey West, who's going to talk about this extraordinary title here. Read it in your own time. So I'm going to try and remember what you told me on the way over, Geoffrey, about your life history. I'm likely to get it wrong. Geoffrey, you can throw things at me when I do. So, born in 1940 in Taunton, so down the road really. Brought up in East London, so kind of honorary colony, I suspect. The top supported centre. Got a fellowship, scholarship to Oxford, Cambridge. Did a PhD in Stanford. Worked at Cornell University, Harvard, Los Alamos, Stanford again, and ended up at the Santa Fe Institute, which is an institute that is kind of sort of fabled in my heart because of all the things we've written about it, which is an institute that looked at complexity science, what we might call system science, and it became president in 2003, is that right? Having been told, you can come to this thing and you won't have any administration, they got it within 6 months and said, you're now president. So help yourself. And it's been there ever since. And I visited Santa Fe Institute, which is somewhere I'd always wanted to go. A couple of years ago, met Geoffrey, and we did the fanboy thing, and he signed a book. We're going to do it with Tim later. So he wrote a book called Scale. If you've not read that book, I'm like a salesman for you. Do read it. We've got copies. In fact, there's a couple of copies in the audience. It's a really good book about the power of these ideas. So I'm going to let Geoffrey speak now. Afterwards, there'll be some sparkly something or other, wine and water, I think, outside. And to begin with, let's hear from Geoffrey. So, thank you. We might be able to. Okay.
Well, thank you. Here we go. Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's only been here a short time, but really enjoying it. I have no idea what campus this is and so forth. So, here's this mouthful of a title. It's a bit pretentious, but it sort of allows me to talk about almost anything. But I will end up trying to talk a little bit in a very big picture framework about some aspects of the future of the planet. But I'm going to take you through a whole bunch of other things. The one thing I won't talk about is in this title, I've decided, is anything about companies. We'll leave that out. I don't know if Peter said, I'm a physicist by training. I spent most of my career doing traditional physics, in particular quarks and gluons and string theory and all the rest of that wonderful stuff. But this is a quote from a man named Stephen Weinberg, who I Nobel Prize 40 years ago, unifying the weak of electromagnetic interactions. And he said very succinctly, our job in physics is to see things simply, to understand a great many complicated phenomena in a unified way in terms of a few simple principles. And that's sort of what I'm aspiring to in this. I've added to it something a little more specific, maybe search for underlying laws and principles leading to a quantitative, mathematizable, therefore meaning computable, predictable, testable conceptual framework, and implicit in that is looking for things that unify and have universal kind of qualities and the interconnectivity. So it's a big picture aspiration. I won't reach this level, but that's behind everything I want to talk about. And I thought I would have a few other quotes from other famous physicists, Jan Weinberg, and one that you're no doubt familiar with because of Rutherford, who gave us the solar system simplistic view of the atom, who made this extraordinary statement that is quite funny, it's arrogant and totally outrageous. We've got no money, so we've got to think. So, so I admire Rutherford for that. I'm really embarrassed by his first statement. And here's another statement from the richest person in the world. I tend to approach things from a physics framework, and physics teaches you to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. And you know who this is. And I'm not sure this is good to have him. Good credibility to this, because Elon Musk. So it's not just physics, it's a way of thinking beyond just in quote, understanding the physical world around us. And lastly, in terms of quotes, is a quote from Max Planck, who gave us the idea of the quantum mechanics. The chief law of physics, the pinnacle of the whole system, is, in my opinion, the principle of least action. I'm not going to tell you what that means technically, for those who are not familiar, what least action is. But in paraphrasing, it is that all of the fundamental laws of physics, from relativity, laws, quantum mechanics, etc., all follow from something being optimized. That is something called the action, something like so optimization, the tendency towards systems trying to become optimal in some sense. What they're optimizing is left open as a question, is crucial. And we'll run through this, and I'll try to point it out as I go. So I want to talk about this, our planet. And first, I just want to define a few things. I would loosely call that the biosphere, as distinct from what the planet really looks like, which is this, which is what we made of the planet. And this I will call, for want of a better phrase, the anthroposphere, or what I prefer to call it actually is the urbanosphere. And of course, it's kind of extraordinary because this is the only planet, as far as we know, in the universe, possibly the only one in the universe, that has all this junk on it, growing all over the bloody place, all of this, and all of it coexists and is interrelated, and it all is dependent on each other, all of it. I mean, this, just to remind you, this is the cartoon of something called the respiratory complex, which is what produces a molecule called the ATP, which is your currency of energy, and that is driving all the way through to this. That's what's driving this. So underline, these are all interconnected and interrelated. And all of them are also what we call complex adaptive systems because they are all evolving and changing depending upon external forces and dynamics. So the idea of complexity in complex systems has become a theme of the 21st century. And indeed, in the turn of the millennium, Stephen Hawking was asked the question, some say that while the 20th century was the century of physics, we're now entering the century of biology. What do you think of this? To which Stephen responded, I think the next century will be the century of complexity. So that's another theme running through this, the idea of complexity and the idea of more systemic kind of thinking. So here's a picture taken by a NASA satellite in 1840 of the planet. Of course, it's not a picture taken by that. It's my guess, really, my calculation actually, of what it might have looked like. Here's what it is in the year I was born, 1940, and here's what it looks like now. And it's kind of extraordinary what's happened, obviously, we're all familiar with it. The planet has burnt up, just gone on burning, because this represents just the burning of the surface of the planet, represented as night lights of urban development. So the planet's become urbanized by burning itself up. And just to give a sense of the scale of that, into the future, that's the past, into the future, we are urbanizing well over 1 million people a week. Maybe it's closer to 2 million people a week. That's if you average between now and mid-century, which means it's like adding a London metropolitan area every couple of months, Manchester every couple of weeks, and the next day every 12 hours. So this time tomorrow there'll be 2 more Exeters. There'll be 2 more Exeters on this planet. And over the weekend there'll be 2 more, and so on, until we drop dead. That's pretty scary if it goes on the way it is. So, that of course is all just a manifestation of something we're all familiar with, which is the extraordinary growth of the population. Since we stopped being biological 10,000 years ago, when we were hunter-gatherers, we discovered language, how to communicate, how to take advantage of economies of scale by working together, by communicating, and most importantly, or equally importantly, was the discovery of agriculture, so we could be sedentary, self-forming communities, build cities, and then there was this gradual rise from our biological capacity of about 5 million people, all the way up to much less than a billion actually, by the time the great discovery of the Industrial Revolution, which was of course the discovery of the exploitation of fossil fuels. And at the same time, the invention and exploitation of capitalism, entrepreneurship, open markets, which has led to all this. It's been unbelievably successful, fantastically. And in that period, the population has just shot straight up. So that we're now essentially, I think maybe we're at about 8 billion people. When I was born, it was just over 2 billion. So that's pretty amazing, actually, in a short period. So, concomitant with that is, of course, the increase of everything else that's associated with the planet, and somehow not moving forward. Oh, I know why. It's told me, it's telling me that Adobe Acrobat will damage my computer. And I don't know how to use it. I have to stop it. Okay. There, okay, let's see. So any metric is a kind of Earth metrics. These are just kind of socioeconomic ones. You can't read them. Everything from GDP, energy use, paper production, and on this side, shrimp aquaculture, carbon dioxide, methane, domesticated land. All of them, of course, go up in this kind of hockey stick fashion. Concomitantly, this was put together by a man who collaborated with George Stephan, Australian, who died maybe just over a year ago, sadly. But they all have this character, and he termed it the Great Acceleration, beginning basically, back from the Industrial Revolution, as we showed. So here we live. Everybody's familiar that we live in an exponentially expanding universe, but most people don't seem to appreciate that we live in a faster than exponentially expanding socioeconomic universe. It's kind of extraordinary, and no wonder many of us feel disenchanted and soulless and so forth. Things are going at the speed at which things are going. So if you're a physicist, let me go back. If you're a physicist and you see curves like this, especially this, you're immediately reminded of curves like this. So what is this? This is the specific heat or heat capacity of propane. What does that mean? That's the specific heat is the amount of heat needed to raise 1 kilogram of propane, in this case, by 1 degree. And you can see what happens as you increase temperature to the right. It increases slowly. Forget about the curve there. Increases slowly, and then goes bonkers up here. And then if you keep increasing the heat, increasing that heat to it, the temperature, it crashes. And of course, you all know what's happened there. It's gone from a liquid to a gas. And that is called a phase transition, locally a tipping point. I don't like very much. Okay, you can use it. And the fact that this is going straight up and sort of effectively going to infinity is called a singularity. So we're very familiar with that, and this looks very similar, that curve on the left, it's very similar to the curve, this curve. In fact, they're not just similar, they're identical. So the question is if we continue raising the temperature, meaning in this case increasing the population, adding more and more socioeconomic energy to the system, is it going to do that? So that's what I mean by the future of the planet, and that's what I will finish the last 5 or 10 minutes of my talk telling you about. And but I have to do all this stuff first to lead up to it. So tipping points and things are actually a major part of what goes on here. Wonderful things, like great centers on the planet for thinking about these kinds of questions. And presumably that's why Peter invited me to give my 2 cents worth of worship about this, and try to convince you that there's some science behind a lot of this. So this is a major part of the GSI's agenda. I'm going to start the major part of this talk by recognizing, first of all, that the fate of the planet is the fate of our cities, because all of these problems that we are dealing with now are from people, of course, but people are cities. Cities are people, that's what they are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cities and the science of cities. So when you think of city, this is what you think of. You think it's infrastructure, it's roads and buildings and general infrastructure. It's physicality. But of course, that's in a certain sense, and I want to convince you, is the uninteresting part of the city. The interesting part of the city is this, because that's what cities are for. The cities are just a stage, a backdrop, a facilitator for increasing social interaction. And that's what's going on here and here. This is New York. 50 years ago, and this is here. Let's look through Exeter. That's what it said anyway. So that's what all those bloody buildings are for. It's just to bring all of you together, all of us together, and to do things like this, to exchange information, to take part of social networks. And those social networks have a characteristic that is illustrated here. Bring people together, so what we're doing here, in fact. A talks to B, B talks to C, C talks back to A. We build by positive feedback on each other. We're continually creating ideas. We're continually innovating. Almost all of those ideas and all of those innovations, no one cares about and nothing happens to them. Be rubbish, most of them. But the amazing phenomenon is that every once in a while, what is going on here, the dynamic of what's going on here, produces the theory of relativity, or a Google, or an Amazon, or quantum mechanics, or a Toyota. That's what it does, and it's all, this whole structure, this whole systemic structure is doing that, and that's what is going on here. That's the point of the city. So here's this extraordinary machine, the most incredible machine that we invented for doing that, and creating this incredible world that we live in. And it's this machine that creates wealth, knowledge, innovation, and ideas in order to increase standards of quality of life for everybody. That's sort of the dynamic of what a city is. But I'm sure many of you have heard of the second law of thermodynamics. It's the most fundamental law of science, supersedes all laws, which says, roughly speaking, if you create order, which is what we've been talking about, and create things, you necessarily create some disorder, and that's called entropy. So whether you like it or not, doing all those things inevitably creates disorder. So whether you like it or not, you're going to get some version of this, social entropy. And the whole point is not to try to stop this, because you can't. All you can do is minimize it, and the only way to minimize it is to understand it, and that's what I want to try to talk about. Including war, by the way. I mean, just a side comment, war, of course, has changed from being a rural phenomenon, battlefield, we say, battlefield. There's no battlefields anymore, even though we might use that term. It takes place here. This is London. This is in war, 1940 Blitz. And of course, its effect on the environment. And one of the things that you don't want to happen is you don't want Exeter to end up looking like this, but you might. or London looking like this, which it might. So, you know, the way we think about cities and the way we tackle all these kinds of problems, we usually deconstruct them. And this is totally arbitrary, this is just some laundry list, and you put boxes around them, and you put boxes around each one of those individual things, and in those boxes you put other boxes. And we have been enormously successful by deconstructing things into smaller and smaller components, and then sort of hoping by putting it all together, we can understand and make progress. We have been, by and large, very successful, with the caveat that we inevitably produce entropy. But of course, one of the things you realize is none of these are not independent. They're all interconnected. Everything's interconnected. And COVID, of course, is one of the great examples. Who would believe that a virus in Wuhan, China, would stop football in Spain and make a shortage of yeast in the United States within a few months? That's pretty amazing that would happen. Why? Because there is a connection between viruses being developed in various places or evolving in certain places and yeast production, believe it or not. Of course, it's extraordinarily weak, and only under very special circumstances do those weak couplings become strong and manifest. But they are there, and in some cases they're very strong and are being ignored. So that's another. So here's a kind of classic example of unintended consequences. You're familiar with this silly little cartoon. We're all familiar with that, and the history of urban development is rampant with this. Okay, so these are called complex adaptive systems. Huge numbers of components, they're continually changing, there are multiple levels of dynamics. But roughly speaking, you can think of it as divided into two kind of pieces that contribute to their dynamics. One is that, like I talked about the city, there's the physicality, the physical nature of its metabolism, if it's an organism, its infrastructure in a city, but energy and resources, all the physical nature, interfaced with the exchange of information, which is what we're doing here. There's social dynamics, social interactions. Okay. So there's all these multiple levels of organization and so on, but the only point to emphasize here is all of this happens through networks. So networks permeate everything we do, whether they're physical or social, and here's a bunch of networks that you're very familiar with. And of course, when you look at those, you're also reminded of the fact that if you were to tear open your skin and look inside you, you would see that you are a bunch of networks, and here you are, pieces of you. There's your cardiovascular system, there's your brain, there's your lungs. But here you see that's a thing that lives inside elephants, it's a tree. But this permeates biology. Biology is random, of course, functions by networks at all scales. And I'm not going to go through, I'm going to skip a bunch of steps, but it turns out these networks have universal properties. And I'm going to just flash on the slide and say these are the generic properties. You probably won't, I'm going to give you time probably to read them because I want to emphasize one thing, a few things. First, they transcend design. These are things that it doesn't matter whether it's a fish, mammal, bird, insect, and so on. But these networks have similar properties that transcend the evolved design. They follow from natural selection. Most importantly, for the purpose of this talk, is that they have evolved to be towards being optimal. So there's a kind of optimization that's come from the continuous feedback that happens through natural selection, as quote survival of the fittest. So for example, the cardiovascular system that we all share, I mean every single mammal that's ever existed, the one that we all share is the one that minimizes the amount of energy your heart has to do to pump blood through it to feed your cells, keep you alive, function, and so on. So that you minimize that so you can maximize the amount of energy you devote to sex, reproduction, and the rearing of your offspring, your genetic material. So that's the idea behind it. So you have this sort of minimization, and if you do that, you now have to believe me, and you do all the fancy mathematics and so on, you predict that if you plotted something like metabolic rate, which is the most fundamental quantity of any system, that is how much energy is needed per second, per day to stay alive versus size, it predicts this line, this extraordinary straight line. And the thing about that straight line is that it has a slope, it's predictably 3/4, that's what that is. And the thing that's surprising about this is that every single one of these organisms, every subsystem of it, every organ, every cell type, every genome type, has evolved, according to natural selection, with its own unique history. Everything is historically contingent. So you might have expected, since everything is historically contingent, if you plotted this, the points would be sort of distributed across the graph, manifesting or reflecting historical contingency, individual histories. Quite the contrary, that has been superseded by the constraints of the network, according to this, and that's the data. And the slope of this is 3/4, which we call sublinear, and the slope of that is 3/4. That was what it would be if it were linear. And this is known as Kleiber's law. And even though I said it was predicted, it was been known for, what is that, 70, 90 years almost. So, this is, it follows from the structure of these networks. So, these scaling laws, these simple scaling laws, which are kind of amazing in their simplicity, given that this is probably the most complex and diverse system in the universe, for all we know. Here's this extraordinary simplicity underlying it, permeate all of biology. So that, for example, here's a simple one about heart rates. This is predicted from the theory. This is predicted to be -1/4, minus meaning it decreases with size. But in fact, I could show you 50 of these things. They're all the same. They're all the same for all kinds of, you can't read it. This is mitochondrial DNA. This is respiratory rate. This is the radius of the aorta. This is the tumor mass. All of them have slopes predicted by the theory, and these are all the predictions, simple multiples of 1/4. And so you have this sort of bizarre phenomenon that here's this unbelievable diversity and complexity of life, but it's all unified by the number 4. 4 underlies, that's the magic number of the biosphere. What can I say? It is. So these slopes are all these simple multiples of 1/4. So just to give you a sense, going back quickly to this, the fact that it's sublinear less than 1/4 means that the bigger you are, the less is needed per cell or per gram of tissue, the bigger you are. So just to give you a sense of that size, what that means, an elephant has about 10 to the 16th cell. 10 to the 16th is, what is that? It's 10,000 trillion. 10,000 trillion cells. But if those 10,000 trillion cells were made into mice, which they could just as well have been, how many mice would that have been? Well, it turns out it's about 20,000. It's about 20,000 mice, the number of cells in biomass. However, an elephant only requires 25,000 food calories to stay alive, but those 20,000 mice require 500,000. So there's an extraordinary economy of scale with size. It's 20 times more. So the bigger the organism, the less energy is needed per cell. There's this systematic economy of scale. Therefore, less damage is done the bigger you are. Therefore, the bigger you are systematically, the longer you live, according to the, so you have to put this into a real theory, of course. I'm just telling you the words. So bigger animals live systematically longer. Here's data. It's a lot of variance in it. I don't want to belabor the point about statistics and so on. I just want to show you, that's us, that's mammals. And there's the slope, 1/4, 0.24. And that's who we are. But here's the point I want to emphasize. Here it is, that's what I just showed you. It's increasing with a slope of close to 1/4. But I showed you a moment ago that heart rates are decreasing with a slope by 1/4, going down. If you multiply the two together, then this one cancels this one. So heart rates times lifespans are constant, don't change with size. And there's the data. And there it is. So and what is heart rates times lifespan? That's the number of heartbeats in a lifetime. So whether you're a shrew that lives for about a year or so, and whose heart rate is about 1,200 times a minute, or a whale who lives for 120 years and goes boom, 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 the number is the same. So it's sort of interesting psychologically, do they experience the same life, even though it's a year for them? Who the hell knows? But it's good to speculate. So just to go back to that a second, so that means, regardless, if you look through the right lens, everybody lives the same length of time. Use the right lens. Now I'm going to show you everybody grows the same way. So here's growth. We've all done it, we've all scaled up. And how does that work? Well, we eat, we metabolize, we send metabolic energy through the networks, they go to the cells, and at the cellular level, they do maintenance work, they repair, they replace ones that have died, and then they add new ones. So you can write an equation for that, and then you derive this curve, this scaling curve, this growth curve, sorry. And it turns out that sublinear scaling is the thing that leads to boundary growth. It stops you growing. It's something that you should have been worried about all your life. How in the hell is it that you eat and you grow, and then at about 16 or 17 you keep eating, in fact you might even eat more, I don't know, and you don't grow anymore. So you don't grow ontogenetically, to say it technically. The reason is, and I will come back to this, it's because the supply is growing sublinearly, but the demand that is adding cells is linear. So linear, you saw, grows faster, so you can't, the rate at which you metabolize can't keep up. You stop automatically. And there it is. That's the data and things. And this underlies, to some extent, the sustainability of the biosphere, the fact that most things, not all, stop growing before they die. And that's crucial. Okay, so there it is for some other ones, and then you can do something sweet. You can I'm not going to go into rescale the size and rescale, I'm not going to go into the details, so that again, if you look through the right lens, this is a small sampling, everybody follows the same growth curve, though they're growing at different rates. Okay. So there's this kind of universality to things. Now, the last thing I'm going to do in biology, I think, is about temperature dependence, because that's very important in terms of climate change and so on. So here's the thing that most people are not appreciative of, unfortunately, and that is, and it's been known a very long time, is that the biochemical reaction rates that produce metabolism, that keep you alive, like all chemical reaction rates, are exponentially sensitive to temperature. This was known by Arrhenius, was one of the people that developed the earliest theory, heuristic theory, anyway, of it. By the way, he's also the person that first did realize the greenhouse gas, the greenhouse effect, back in, I don't know, early 1900s. Anyway, it depends exponentially on temperature. So that means a small change in temperature has a very large effect. And indeed, so all these things, all these rates, and all these times, which are quite different in character, but all related in some way or another to metabolism and the use of energy, all are exponentially sensitive to change in temperature. And the numbers are, if you do it, from the biochemistry, is a 2-degree change, which is what we were talking about in terms of climate change, means a 15 to 20% increase in rates, and similarly in times, which is phenomenal. That's why, it's not freezing cold at the moment any longer in Exeter in November. It was, when I was born in Taunton, it was fucking cold in the middle of 1940. So, here, I'm not going to do this. I can do one thing, and that is, that's relevant. You can use this whole theory to calculate things like the maximum height of trees depending upon the ambient temperature. There's also water in here, we did other things and so on. But you can predict that as its effect on temperature, and there's the observations. You can see there's obvious differences, and we've looked at statistics of this, but it's pretty damn good. So that you can now have a theoretical basis for understanding not just why there are taller trees in some places and not in others, much more importantly, what happens if you change the climate. And so that's what this is. I'm not going to dwell on that at all here. I just want to summarize the biosphere here and then move on to the anthroposphere. So just to repeat what I've said, we have these systematic scaling laws dominated by these quarter powers. There's this economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less you need per cell. The pace of life systematically slows the bigger you are. I didn't emphasize that, but I talked about heart rate slowing down and so on, the bigger you are. Growth is sigmoidal, which means technically you grow quickly and then you stop, you reach a stable size and maturity, and then you die. And all of this can be put in the language, the mathematical language of the dynamics of networks. And now I want to take this framework and take it over to the anthroposphere. And the first question you ask is, just in terms of data, is there any evidence that cities are scaled versions of one another? Is Exeter, despite appearances, just a scaled down version of London? Or whatever. Okay, and is there some universal behavior? So you might, of course you just asked the question, I don't have your answer, but if you've done this work, and you saw that there are these hidden laws of biology that follow from networks, and you recognize, of course, that cities are network systems, highly networked systems, both in terms, first of all, of their physicality, the roads and electrical lines and so on. Maybe there are similar hidden laws of cities reflecting the generic properties of cities if, like biological organisms, the process, the sort of evolutionary processes are tending them towards trying to optimize various things. The other part of a city, which is even more important, I mentioned earlier, is of course the role of social networks. That's what cities are there to do, is to support and facilitate social networks. And that's what this is, the nodes are people, and those lines are their friends, and so on. And those networks, those social networks, have very special properties, among others. The fact that, first of all, we have modular behavior, we have families, groups, divisions, departments, and so on, which have a kind of regular structure, which again, I'm sorry, I won't go into. But also, something very important about these networks, despite this picture, which you may have seen, this is extremely misleading. This is just the topology of the network, because each one of those nodes has to be in some place. You have to be, sitting somewhere. You have to be in your office, in your bathroom, and not only that, you have to be traveling, you have to be moving, you have to take the kids to school, you have to go to the store, and so on. So you're tied, so these two networks are actually intimately related and interlinked. And that's what I try to illustrate here. What's going on here is, in fact, the interconnection between both the physical networks and the social networks. So here are the similar set of principles one might postulate. I'm again not going to dwell on them in terms of social networks. And but the important thing is in terms of urban networks, I should say. But the point here is that again, it's this idea of optimization, that the city is involved towards optimizing. What is it trying to optimize? Well, the hypothesis here is that one of the things it does is to minimize travel time. When you go home after this, you try to go home, you don't sort of drive north to Taunton and then come back. You don't go, you try to go home the easiest, quickest way possible, whatever it is, even though you have to go to streets like this, but you would like to go in a straight line to your house. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, in terms of your social interactions, what the city is doing is forcing more and more and facilitating more and more social interactions in order to ultimately create ideas and wealth and so on. That's what you are participating in, effectively. So that's the idea, and to put these into mathematics and try to derive similar things as we did before. And indeed, if you look at the physical side of cities, and this is something mundane, number of petrol stations versus population size, again, plotted. I should have said, oh, it was very bad. I should have said, you know, these plots are logarithmic plots. So I apologize that, let me just go back 20 minutes. If you try to plot a mouse and an elephant on the same graph linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4, the graph would extend from here to Taunton. Basically, not that I forget, but it would a very, very long way. You'd have to have a piece of graph paper. So that's why you're forced, whether you like it or not, to plot them logarithmically means instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, you go 1, 10, 100, 1,000, and so on. And that's what we're doing here too. You can see 10, 100, 1,000 for the number of petrol stations, and similarly with the population. 100,000 million. Okay, and you can see very good evidence that they scale in a very systematic way, just like they did in biology, even more so that this is linear and they're sublinear. The only difference is instead of a slope of 0.75, it's a slope of 0.85. Okay, so there's an economy of scale, and that gets manifested, by the way, in something non-intuitive. Therefore, if the physical side is scaling sublinearly, the amount of entropy being produced is sublinear, naively anyway, and so the carbon footprint of a city per capita decreases with size. So in the United States, New York is the greenest city, and where I live in Santa Fe, which is maybe a little smaller than Exeter, is probably one of the more fragrant, I would say. So there it is, and you can see the slope is less than 1. I want to focus on social networks because they have this property which I mentioned earlier of positive feedback. We build on each other, and building on each other translates ultimately into, instead of sublinear scaling, the bigger you are, the less per capita, into superlinear scaling. The bigger you are, the more people, the more interactions, more things happen. So that, and concomitantly, instead of the pace of life slowing down, the pace of life speeds up. So that just comes from this positive feedback in social networks. And here's the evidence, here's the data. This is a bunch of urban metrics in different countries. These are, I think all of these are Sweden. This is company turnover, property taxes, divorces, creative people, restaurants in Holland, patents in the United States. This is the innovation of the city. This is crime in Japan, GDP of France. And if you look, they all basically have the same slope, 1.1. Roughly, they all hover around 1.15. All superlinear and all pretty much the same, even though superficially they're completely different things. Why are they all the same? From this viewpoint, they're all the same because they all come from the same thing, namely you and me talking to one another, people interacting, the dynamics of social networks, so that there's a complete integration of this among things that are superficially quite different. The number of, who would believe that the number of patents would be related to the number of restaurants? They are. Amazing. So here it is, that's just the universe, and we just replotted some. I'm not going to dwell on that. So to put it in English, the good, bad, and ugly come together. On average, if you double the size of a city within an urban system, then systematically you save about 15% on all infrastructure, and at the same time, you increase all the good things, income, wealth, patents, education, and so on. But also all the bad things, like, well, police not bad, but crime, social interaction, I mean, AIDS and flu, disease, all by 15%, including COVID. So much better during COVID to be in Exeter than in London, but in general, much better to be in London than in Exeter if you want a sexy, busy, more culture, I'm not going to say. But obviously, so that's the point. That's the point. And so here's, just to show you, we also measured social interactions, number of social interactions, by looking at billions and billions of telephone calls between people. These are mobile phone calls, and that's what these are. That's what plotted here. The number of mobile phone calls between people, plotted versus size, and as predicted, so to speak, the other way around, they have a slope very close to this 1.15, similar to the others. So that they do indeed all sort of, the theory is quite consistent. And one of the big questions, by the way, is what happens when we go to this two-dimensional, soulless way of interacting? Does that change things? To what extent does it change things, and so on? That's just a totally open question. I don't think it will, but anyway. So here's just to sort of repeat what I've already said. The pace of biological life slows down the bigger you are, that's heart rates, whereas the pace of social life increases, and this is just a whimsical plotting of ancient data on walking speeds in cities as a function of city size. It's fairly systematically increases. So the last part, try to finish up very quickly, is now taking all of this to the entire planet. This is what I've been leading up to the entire planet. So here's the idea. If I'd given this talk, probably even 25 years, or certainly 50 years ago, this would not make sense. That is the idea of treating the planet as a single entity, socioeconomically especially. But in the last 25 years especially, whether we like it or not, we become globalized. The internet, of course, has done an enormous amount, but I mean, you just look at the exchange of goods, traffic, shipping, and so on, exchange of people. We're now, you could imagine that we can consider the planet as a single entity. So it's a huge extension. In the same way that you consider, in the way I'm talking, this kind of coarse-grained way of talking, that I've considered a city as a single entity. I mean, I should have said that's sort of a starting point. You can take this work, and we've done it in some instances, deconstruct down to deconstructing the city into different components and so on, deconstructing organisms and so on. But here I want to go the other way around. I want to think of the planet as one single entity and ask, is it, can we think of it as one of these network complex adaptive systems, which I will then refer to as the anthroposphere. And if that is true, if that were true, then we could think of that work on cities and the work in biology and say, then we would expect, if we looked at these metrics, then they should scale, and they should scale in a superlinear fashion. That would be a kind of test, at least, of whether the idea is crazy or not. And so if you take the data, there it is. And it's pretty good. I mean, you can see it's not like the other, it's got kinks in it and so on. But considering the crudity of what we're doing and the how recent sense of globalization has taken place, it's pretty, I find it pretty convincing. And you notice it is indeed superlinear. Okay? So let's take it as that for the moment. So I want to go back, before progressing with that, to the idea of metabolic rate, because I wanted to introduce the concept of a social metabolic rate. So this is the biological metabolic rate. So this was just what you got was the amount of energy you need per day to stay alive, how much food you need per day to stay alive. That's called the basal metabolic rate. And that's really what I was talking about here. Okay? That was really the basal metabolic rate, the minimum amount you need to stay alive. And I didn't point out, if you actually looked at the graph, it's less than 100 watts. It's just under 100 watts. So that's all we want. That's 2,000 food calories a day, which may seem like a lot. It's actually, well, we probably don't have incandescent light bulbs here anymore, but it's like an old incandescent light bulb. And in fact, here I put it in. Here it is, 100 watts, 2,000 food calories a day, your light bulb. Okay, good. But of course, you also have to be active. You have to hunt and gather, and that's called field in biology, that's called field active metabolic rate. So we hunt and gather, and if you add that in to what we've already done, it turns out it's about just over twice, 2 or 3 times bigger than the basal rate, so twice as much. And there it is, I just drew it in. So that's your active metabolic rate, and we will roughly follow that. And that was true for us up until about 10,000 years ago, before we discovered language and agriculture and became the kind of creatures we now are. And now I want to ask about social metabolic rate, and I'm going to call that our active metabolic rate. Today, I want to call our social metabolic rate. So this is the energy that's needed to maintain all of the shit around us. All these buildings and your car and your clothes and your refrigerator and your cell phone and all the rest, because that's who you are. I mean, one thing you have to recognize, which is sort of obvious, there's no such thing as an individual human being. That doesn't exist. We are only human beings in relationship to others. Not only that, we're only a human being in 2024 if you have one of these, and you have a wallet with credit cards, and you have a refrigerator, and so on. That's who you are. Otherwise, you're not a modern you're not part of the socioeconomic system. So that's who you are. That's the basal rate. That's the basal rate. But then, of course, there's the equivalent to the active rate, which is all the activity that creates stuff, that builds new buildings and creates new ideas, and so on and so forth. All of that stuff creating new wealth. All of that stuff is the analog to active. And if you add all that up, instead of being where we are here, just over 100 to 200 watts, we're 11,000 watts. Well, if you're American, I think if you're British, it's probably not much different. So 11,000 watts, 100 times bigger than your basal biological rate watts. It is actually basal. So that's pretty impressive. So you can ask, how big are you? Well, that's how big you are. You weigh 30,000 kilograms. That's how big an animal is that uses that much. So it is ridiculous, in my opinion, to say the planet has 8 billion people. Who cares about 8 billion people? What you care about is that we're using 2.5 trillion times people energy. That is, if we were biological people, there'd be we are equivalent on the planet today to several trillion. That is scary. So, that's what or a dozen elephants. Each one of us in this room is like a dozen elephants. Okay, so what about the growth of the anthroposphere? So it's the same kind of equation that we had for biology. You know, the social metabolic rate goes towards maintaining what's here, and then adding new stuff. Adding new stuff, meaning ideas. I mean, new stuff meaning not just infrastructure, but ideas and creating new people, and institutions, and so on, everything. So it's a horrendous equation, that. But it's so. And I call that, pretentiously and arrogantly, the master anthropocene equation. I'm glad you're not. So, supply is maintenance plus growth. Maintenance is demand, if you like. And this is the only equation I think I've put it in. There it is. That's the equation here for those that know about it. It's very simple. But believe it or not, that's everything. Because the only thing you need to know if you don't know, all it is, this means sum, and you're summing beginning with you, and we just count. You, and we end up at 8 billion. Well, we can do that for everything. I mean, so in principle, this is everything. Okay. So in the biosphere, you saw, let's go back to this at the top. Supply plus maintenance demand. In the biosphere, this was sublinear. This is linear, so this eventually beats this. Linear beats the sublinear. Growth stops because this eventually can't go negative, so growth stops. That's what that is. So growth stops and it leads to a finite size or so-called finite carrying capacity. That's great. That's what was in existence before modern man and women came along. That's what gave rise to this. But in the anthroposphere, we have the other way around. Supply is super, it's not even super linear, it's super duper linear, basically. And it's out, completely dominates the demand. So we keep growing, just keep growing. That's what we've done in the last 10,000 years. So we lead to open-ended growth. There it is, there's a cartoon of it. So this is good. This is excellent. Because what it says is, we have a theory. Social interactions have positive feedback, they lead to superlinear scaling. Superlinear scaling leads to super exponential growth and open-ended growth. That's exactly what we see. That's exactly what. So we have a nice fundamental theory, if you like, fundamental meaning, beginning with social dynamics, that leads to what we see. So this is just any old socioeconomic metric versus time. That's what it predicts. So that's good in principle. And indeed, if you do the arithmetic, if you do the mathematics, it beautifully predicts this. Beautifully, actually. It's quite astounding. But it also predicts, and it predicts all of these, in principle. Some, not all of them. But it also predicts for individual cities, and we've done it for many cities. Even some of this stuff is predicted, you can do it, I'm not going to go into any of this. So it's a very nice theory. So that's good, that's all good. But it comes with a fatal consequence. Well, could be fatal consequence. And that's this line here, this thing here. Because you notice this goes up and keeps going, just like it did for that, for this. It goes up, you saw what happened before, and indeed this theory then tells you that it leads to a singularity, at t equals tc, a phase transition or tipping point, and just like this, like it's identical. It's interesting, the mathematics for this part is essentially identical, it turns out. And the question is, does it do that from the mathematics? And the answer is no. It doesn't do that. But it still collapses, unfortunately. It collapses slower. Put it down, it collapses. So you don't want that, so that's not good. That means that if you keep going if you believe any of this stuff, we collapse. So what do? How do you stop it? So here's the cartoon version. You start growing, and you would hit the singularity and collapse. Well, what you realize is this has been derived assuming things sort of stay the same within a given sort of culture, paradigm, whatever. So what you realize is that what you can do to avoid the collapse that would be supposedly inevitable is that you have to change the conditions under which this is derived. What does that mean? That means a major innovation or a major paradigm shift or a major reinvention. That is, this might be something like the change from, I don't know, Stone Age to Iron Age. The fact that we call it the Iron Age means that dominated the culture, or the computer age, or the internet age, or coal, or whatever. But something dominates a major paradigm shift. So if you do that, you can start over again. So before you reach the singularity, you start over again, you reinvent yourself, so to speak. So you can actually think of this even at an individual level, if you like. But you start over again and you would take off. But of course, you then hit a singularity, potentially, and you have to do it again and again. So there's a kind of theorem that if you demand, as we have done since the Industrial Revolution and the invention of capitalism, open-ended growth is fundamental to our existence presently, then you have to have cycles of innovation. Well, that's been, people have talked about that for a long time. The only difference is here that this is now a quantitative theory, and it tells you you have to do it accelerated, in an accelerated fashion. Namely, the time between here and here is necessarily shorter than here to here and there to there. But in a predictable way, believe it or not. That is, it's governed by the theory, and it tells you. So this is not mine. I don't know who this guy is. Someone one day will tell me who he is. I'll try to find out. I found this on the web, so I could get sued or something. And it looked like, what I just showed you, so I quickly downloaded it. But what it is, it's the time taken. This is at a sort of lower level of innovation, but it's exactly the same idea, it can be applied, to the time taken, this number in brackets, to reach a 10 million customers. So it's kind of a proxy, maybe, for the rate at which things are happening. And if you take these numbers, which I didn't bother to do here, and you plot them, they agree embarrassingly precisely with what this theory predicts in terms of their progression. And here's a more, much more grandiose version, not mine, and I forgot to put it down. A man named Ray Kurzweil, who's made a big deal out of the idea of singularity. But he put this data together. I don't care about this, but down here. But this is what he wrote. He said was the major singularities. And this line is what's predicted by the theory, or this line, which is, I should have said, I should have told you what the axes are, I'm very sorry. This is how long ago something happened. So 10 to the 10th years ago, 10 million, just over 1 billion years ago, cells developed several billion years ago, and it took them about 1 billion years, that's how long it takes to develop it, all the way down to here, the internet, which took place tens of years ago, 10, 20 years ago, and it took 10, 20 years to develop. So it's all on one logarithmic plot again. And this is the prediction of the theory. It's another way of plotting it is this. It's exactly the same plot, except this one is now, this is logarithmic, but this is linear, so you can see that sort of in reality, things all happen at once. And that line is effectively a prediction of the theory. So here's, I did have one other equation, and I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. I will finish up with this. This is actually the highly simplified formula for that curve, the curve in which we are participating. And I just wanted to show you, I thought, everybody should know some mathematics. And my God, it's formed the way we live, actually. It probably is the language of the universe. So Tc is the value of is the time of the singularity. T is time. As T approaches Tc, this number gets smaller and smaller, and it's 1 divided by a number that's getting smaller and smaller. Therefore, this whole number is getting bigger and bigger, and when T equals Tc is 0, 1 over 0 is infinity, goes to infinity. So that's why T is, I'm sorry to be pedantic, it's just about everybody on the same page. But the important thing I want to emphasize is the theory predicts this value and this value. So it tells you everything about that curve, but it also tells you something else, a very nice test for this whole theory, and that is if you look at this, and if you're familiar with this, what it says in mathematically, if you plot this logarithmically against the distance, the time to the singularity, T minus Tc, logarithmically, it predicts for the planet as a whole should just follow a straight line. And so we did it, and there it is, a straight line. That was the data on the straight, it was remarkably good. And this is for global energy use. And time is going that way, because it's Tc minus, I mean, real time, calendar time is going, I'm sorry about that. There's no other way of plotting it. But the thing that we discovered was, that was beautiful, we were very excited about that. But then we discovered something bizarre, that actually it's 2 straight lines. Which means that here, there was a very natural and obvious break. And where was it? It was in the mid-70s. I wrote 1975, but roughly somewhere in the mid-70s. A big break. So we avoided a singularity in the mid-70s. And we've speculated and talked to many historians. scientists about that. And it could be, that was in fact the beginning of globalization, roughly speaking, it was the beginning of it. It was also a time of great unrest, women's movement and so on. All these things were interconnected, but who knows, I don't know. Anyway, I'll leave that. But it shows up in all these things. There's water and the question of what you expect. So I don't know, that's, I'm going to stop pretty much here. I would just summarize that last part by saying that some boundary growth leads to this so-called finite time singularity. We say finite time because it happens in some finite time in the future. And it would lead to collapse unless you innovate in order to intervene. And whether you like it or not, it will occur faster and faster. So you're on a sort of running treadmill that's going faster and faster. And it's just an example of the accelerating pace of all socioeconomic life. And I'm sure you've all, even if you're young, you might have even felt it, but certainly at my age, I've certainly felt it. The pace of life is so much faster than when I was a young man and young boy. And the thing that I think had not enough attention has been paid to is this last part, something extraordinary. Here's this pace of life speeding up at this extraordinary rate. But you know, we biologically and neurologically are the same as we were when we started 10,000 years ago, but 100,000 years ago. So we have the same, basically the same brain and biology, and yet, you know, you have to adapt to this bloody thing all the time, and you know, especially at my age, when I still collaborate, you know, these people come up and, you know, now we've got a Google Doc instead of, I mean, you have to keep changing. Instead of, you know, a couple of years of relaxation, you want something else, and everybody seems to know about it except me. So that is part of this, and I think that is a crisis. I think there's a looming crisis, and just to throw out something totally non-scientific, that's why it's very likely we will have an authoritarian ruler in the United States tomorrow, possibly. Because I think people are very much being left behind with this. It doesn't matter what income group they're in, many feel getting almost disenfranchised from the general culture. Anyway, that's nothing to do with science. So that's us. Sisyphus rolling the old rock up the hill, and then it rolls down again, you're going to roll it again. Except Sisyphus had it easy, because the speed at which he pushed it up and the speed at which he rolled down was the same each time. We have to roll it up faster, and it rolls down faster each time. So it's quite daunting, in my opinion. So finally, so the question is, to what extent is any of this long-term sustainable, and what do we actually have to do to intervene? I'll leave that open. I'm going to miss this out because I've gone on too long, about a counter to this, about reproductive rates. But we definitely need a new paradigm to be thinking about this, much more integrated, bringing all these things together. And we need something that integrates all the things we've been talking about, all the usual sciences, as well as systemic science. And of course, take grand use of big data and AI and machine learning, which are going to be crucial in this, I think, in understanding this. But be mindful, if you do it mindlessly, which as far as I can tell most of it is, it'll only be like that sleek cartoon I have a bloody car increasing the lanes of the highway. And finally, lest you think, it is speculative, obviously, this last one. But here's the greatest mathematical physicist of certainly the 20th century, von Neumann, without whom I wouldn't be clicking this button and working on this machine. And on theories of economics, of computation, of AI, by the way, almost everything around us, due to this extraordinary man, who sadly died young, who made this extraordinary statement in 1953: the ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race beyond which human affairs as we know could not continue. Very That's pretty amazing. I think that he said that back then. He was wrong. It wasn't. We're still going. And this is 70 years ago. So maybe I'm wrong. So I see, so just to put it in perspective, I see what I try to do here is put a little bit of flesh on this statement. It's very unusual of von Neumann not to, he developed so many things with everything in mathematics. He developed so many things. This he never developed. He just made these statements. And I suppose I should. These are people actually do work, I should say. And the other reason I showed them because they did it all, but also many young people in very different fields. There's chemists, anthropologists, ecologists, mathematicians. Here's an ex-student of mine who is now professor of psychiatry at the University of Minnesota. Let's see, Vicky is a professor at the business school at MIT. So they do all these, it's hugely interdisciplinary and so on. So all these models. And these four, I started it out with the social part out. They did nothing. So I gave them money. They're all very distinguished. And this last part was done with these people. And I think that's it. Oh no! Oh, I don't want to show this. I probably shouldn't have been in there. I will do this. You said my book, and I will do it. That's the British version of the book. You can find most of this in this book. That's the hardback, and that's the paperback. So I'll finish there. So I'm going to probably way too long.
Thank you, Geoffrey.